Hi, teacher Vinny, how are you? I'm just waiting for my guest to arrive so we can actually begin, okay? So just bear with me a moment. See if I can. Hi there. Hi, Henan. Welcome. I'm very excited about today's topic because it's something that's very close to my heart, yeah? The identity. Um, I've had some interesting experiences learning Portuguese and all about my identity, so I hope we have something interesting to say about the topic. Uh, and I'm going to be joined by Clara, who you know, Vinny, yeah? But maybe you didn't know that she's actually a qualified psychologist as well as an English teacher, yeah? Which is an awesome thing. Okay, you're hanging your clothes up. You've been doing some laundry then, I guess. There's a lot of laundry when you have a baby, yeah? That's the thing. Yeah, so I don't know when you guys were learning English, uh, kind of felt that you were becoming or you were changing into a different kind of person, and what went on in your mind as you were going through that process. And that's one of the very interesting things that we're going to be discussing today. And also, it happens at different stages as well of what you're learning. Hi Sylvia, great to have you. Thank you so much. I hope that some of what we say may or may not relate to what your thesis is about, but of course we're talking about learners and not necessarily about teachers or teachers as learners, yeah? So let me see if I can find Clara. This is the most boring part about the beginnings of lives, yeah? Especially if you have a partner. You always have to wait and it takes a little while, and in those videos it's always a bit strange when people people join us. Okay, there we go. Okay, here she comes. Hi there.
Hello.
Hi, Clara. I was just saying before you joined us, um, many people know you. Yeah, they know you as an English language teacher, but those people who only know you via English language teaching don't actually know that you're a psychologist as well.
Yes, yes, I'm a graduate psychologist, but life took me a different way.
The other interesting thing is that today is your birthday, isn't it?
You had to go and say that, didn't you?
We should celebrate.
Well, I hope I have been celebrating all day, but let's see what happens now in the evening.
So a very happy birthday to you, and I hope we can
Thank
drink some wine
you.
later on.
Thank you very much. I hope so too.
Okay, so we are here to talk about identity and language learning and if and what changes. Um, but perhaps the theme that we have to begin with, opa, your camera has gone down to the ceiling
Sorry.
there. It's a bit loose, yeah. I think the thing that we have to begin with is to be clear that identity is not something that's fixed, and it's something that happens. Changing and negotiating your identity happens all the way at moments in your life, and it doesn't matter if you're learning a language or not, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, I think, well, I don't think nowadays people know that depending on where you are and which role you are assuming, yeah, your identity does change accordingly. Yeah,
Hmm. So we all go through moments when we kind of find ourselves in new situations, and that could be anything, couldn't it? That could be a new job, moving to another country, becoming an adult, yeah, having to pay bills, becoming a
absolutely,
teenager, moving to a different school.
absolutely. And often it's very hard for us to uh, go into new situations exactly because of that. Yeah, we haven't got an identity yet. We need to sort of tentatively find out where we're treading, what we're doing. So that's why new situations can be very scary.
Absolutely. And when we think about adding the language to it, is another facet of the same process that we all go through. Yeah, and it kind of changes what we can think about ourselves. Yeah, and we're going to talk about this later, but that is especially true when we think about the progress that you make in a language.
Uh, y- Somebody's telling that there is an echo in my voice, and I can actually hear it
Oh,
too.
I wonder what that's all about. That's really annoying, isn't it?
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm keep thinking it must be me because I'm the common factor. A number of my guests have had echoes before, and I'm wondering if I'm related to it. I'm trying to turn
Mm.
off any equipment I have here that may be creating interference. Yeah, I have, for example, let me just try this. I have an external microphone which is attached to my computer. Let's see if it's that.
Okay, I'm gonna say
Okay.
something just to test it. Yeah, I can still hear myself a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I really need to investigate. I hope it's not too distracting for you guys, because what we're talking about is really, really important, I think, and it's something that everybody goes through when they're learning a
Mm,
language. Um,
absolutely.
so yeah, when we think about ourselves and our identities, we ourselves, whatever where we are in life, we have different identities in a sense because we have our professional identity, our family identity. What else do we have? We have maybe for example, for me, my national identity is quite important. Being here in Brazil,
Mm,
because it's something that is reinforced most of the time when I speak to other people.
absolutely.
Gender. What other
Mm,
factors are there?
mhm, mhm. Well, I think it's very interesting, for example, when we consider uh, perhaps family identities. Yeah, I can give some examples about myself because family-wise, I'm the fifth, the youngest of
Mm.
five children, and within my family, my identity tends to be very much the baby daughter or the youngest one, or and it's an identity that I have exclusively within my family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm somebody saying something else about the echo. Let's see, Alex is asking, would you Dennis by any chance more than one device at the same time?
I don't have volume. I don't know if you could check your computer, Clara, that your sound is actually turned off, although
It
I know that
is.
you're not logged in. Yeah, I'll have to find out what's going on. It's really very strange.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, so psychology, your socialization, your family environment, all these can affect your identity, yeah? Um,
absolutely, absolutely.
and do you think all of those things, so separate things, professional identity, national identity, gender, do they also play a role in the formation of your identity as a language user, a second language user?
Well, I think that's something that cannot be separate, yeah, because when people learn language, they have reasons. They all have reasons for learning languages, and sometimes those reasons are connected. Well, they are always connected to some of these roles. Yeah, for example, we have many, we know of
Clara, so we're just waiting. So we're having a few tech.
much connected. You just froze for a bit now.
Ah,
Can
I thought that
you?
you froze. One of us froze. That's okay. Yeah,
Okay.
so they're all interconnected. Absolutely, yeah.
Mm. Uh, a good thing, I don't hear myself anymore. Like I don't hear the
Oh,
echo.
interesting. And
So
neither do I, which is very interesting. Uh-huh.
something
Um,
happened there. The echo got fixed.
uh, because when we think about learning the second or the third or whatever language it is, we are kind of going into a space where we're saying, what is my new role in this world of L2? And you're coming along with an awful lot of baggage related to your role as a professional, your role as a person within your family, all of these different roles.
Mm, absolutely. And as I said before, yeah, when we go into a new situation, we are still learning what a role is going to be. And learning a language can put an extra layer of pressure on people, because you're not only going into a new environment, yeah, you are going to a new environment without being able to fully communicate. If we think about learners, yeah, because of course they will be in different stages of their learning process, but often it can be really, really hard, yeah.
Yeah. So emotion plays a big role as well in identity formation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We know of people who develop very strong emotions in relation to language learning. And
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes that
not that you would want us to mention this, but your mother, for example, has quite strong emotional connection to English. Yeah.
she does. She does, yeah. She's been trying to learn it for many, many years, and she's reached a barrier. And it's not related to anything other than her feelings of believing she can't get past a certain level in the language. Yeah, she believes that about herself. And so she can't get past them. So it's a whole, as a teacher, when you work with her, there has to be a certain level of empathy, because it's not only about language teaching, it's also about understanding that that particular student needs first to, let's say, tear down that wall so that they can get past it. But the way that wall gets torn, it can
Yeah.
be traumatic. So it needs to be done really carefully and knowingly, and as I mentioned before, with a lot of empathy.
Yeah, and so this relates to the idea of the affective filter, where perhaps we're just slightly changing the perspective here in relation to the affective filter, because we've often talked about it before, where we say that to have a positive environment where you trust the environment, you trust your colleagues, it's an experience that you really want and you enjoy it. Your affective filters come down, but it also plays your identity as a learner plays an enormous role in your ability or not to remove these affective filters.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I don't know, what do you think, thinking about personality, which is kind of an outward expression of identity, when somebody speaks a second or third language, do you think that their personality is completely different? It's a completely separate identity?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I don't know the people who are watching us, whether they are language users and they feel that way. But I don't believe that personality does change. The personality changes, like a new personality forms. Yeah, but I do believe, because of the different social contexts and the different structure through which language develops, we tend then to perhaps have certain traits of our personality be stronger or weaker in a second or third language that we might speak. Yeah, I believe that very strongly.
So it grows out of your current identity, personality, and forms a slightly different version of the same one or an extension of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was mentioning before, for example, the fact that being the youngest child in my family, when I speak Portuguese, especially in a context with my family, I tend to be the silly one because I'm the young one, yeah, the youngest one, and that's actually the role that I'm expected to play, yeah. However, when I speak English, I have never been put in that role because my family doesn't speak English. So I honestly wouldn't even know how to do that if I had to do it in
So,
English. Yeah.
so let's talk about ourselves. Yeah. I mean, there are two sides to it. Yeah. So how are we perceived by others in our languages, and how do we perceive ourselves? Now let's start by how others perceive us. And I think maybe the best people to talk about each other is each other. So I can talk about how I believe that you're perceived, both in Portuguese and in English, and then you can talk about how I perceive, perhaps, yeah. And I find it very interesting because I think the way that you're related to what you just said, in your family environment, your your personality, your identity in Portuguese isn't the same. It's very, very different from the way you act in Portuguese, in English, sorry.
Mm,
And when I see it, because we speak 90% of the time in English, yeah,
mm,
and then sometimes in Portuguese. But when I hear you speaking to other people in Portuguese, I find it really interesting because you're not you are, but you are not exactly the same person that I see in English. Because I feel that
mm,
in English you're far more confident and not just in your bearing, but also the way you use your voice. I've sometimes perceived when you speak in Portuguese, for example, that you seem to be a little bit more uncertain about what you're saying because pitch is a different thing. You tend to be a higher pitched person in my opinion in Portuguese than you are in English, and
mm,
that high pitch
mm.
adds uncertainty.
Sure.
Um, so I don't know if it's worth experimenting a little bit now for us to both speak Portuguese a little bit, just so this may not come through because we're in a bit of a fake situation, yeah? So the difference
Sure.
between my voice in English and my voice in Portuguese may or may not be perceived as well, yeah?
Uhum, uhum.
Então, o que você acha que é diferente em minha voz quando eu falo português do que quando eu falo inglês?
A gente já falou um pouco sobre isso, né? Eu acho que
Uhum,
quando você fala português, da mesma forma como você falou a respeito do inglês para mim, que a minha voz de repente não é tão alta, né, no sentido do tom, eu acho que quando você fala português, a tua voz fica um pouco mais alta, né?
uhum.
E a minha percepção é de que em português é difícil achar uma palavra, mas é como se você fosse assim, a nice guy, né? Assim, um cara legal, porque
Ah, mas
você sempre tem uma voz agradável, né? Nesse
então em
sentido.
inglês eu não sou muito legal.
Não, eu acho que em inglês tem outras nuances, né? Justamente por causa da questão da voz ser mais profunda, eu acho
Uhum.
que vem também a questão confidence. And can we please switch back to English? It's very hard to do this in
Sure,
Portuguese.
okay. Yeah.
Sorry, but it's related to sounding more confident. Yeah, I think in Portuguese you sound very pleasant, very nice, I think it's some more accommodating perhaps. And it
Mm,
might be cultural as well, because I do think that language-wise, yeah, Brazilian people are very nice and sympathetic and accommodating. So when you as an immigrant are speaking a language of the country you're living in, yeah, of course there is this uh, desire to fit in and to be like the people who are around you. So I do perceive
mhm.
that when you're speaking Portuguese.
I feel that it's almost like my version is perhaps the more common version in that speaking in the second language there is a bit more uncertainty. The pitch of the voice is higher because of the uncertainty, and yours is the unusual one because you are so much more. Your voice carries much more authority when you speak English. And in my opinion, not in all cases and all moments. No, I'm not saying generally
Sure.
you lack confidence in Portuguese. You don't, but
Mm,
there's a
mm,
general tendency I can see there, which is the kind of opposite of what many people experience.
mm, mm. Yeah, we have discussed this before in the sense that um, sometimes, in my case, yeah, my love for English has made me adopt English as my own language. Yeah, so whenever, even when we are not talking to each other, or even when I'm not in a context where I have to speak English, I still choose English over Portuguese. And that's not because I don't like Portuguese, but in terms of the feelings I have, yeah, I do feel like I express myself better in English, perhaps. I think it's very funny, but as a person, I do think that English, it's sort of like it represents me a little bit better than
Hmm.
Portuguese
Hmm.
does. I don't know, which which is
There,
very, very interesting.
uh-huh. There are a couple of comments here, and there's one from I actually don't know your real name, Gypsy Bourgeois. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but he says that. Brazilians do tend to be much more apologetic with their language
I
as in
agree.
British, yeah, which is definitely true. So there is the cultural emphasis, as you mentioned,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then less, more not sarcastically, more funnily, Alex has commented there that I unlock my better English self when I speak Brazilian Portuguese. Yeah, thank you, Alex. I think I appreciate that. um,
Absolutely. I
but of
think in the
course,
same, I was just going to add to the comment, yeah. I think in the same way as you unlock your your best British self, perhaps I become more assertive in English because the language allows me that excuse, yeah. Since you you can be more
mhm,
assertive without being considered impolite or without being considered rude. Whereas
mhm,
perhaps the same assertiveness in Portuguese might be perceived, especially from a woman, might be perceived a bit as menacing or rudeness. I don't
it's true. I mean, when I speak English, when in the past when I've been training teachers and so on, there have been times when I have been relatively direct because that's not only my style as a person, but also English allows much more for that, and that can kind of be a little bit of a surprise sometimes to people who don't know me. And I recognize that is not the case in Portuguese, and so
know.
I'm not as direct in Portuguese because of where I am. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, of course, the other thing is we are talking about, you are a super proficient user of English. I'm an okay proficiently user of Portuguese. And so the question of identity perhaps is more fully formed. It's still not completely formed, more fully formed than other learners. And
Mhm.
other learners go through a lot more difficulty and a struggle. Yeah, we think about beginners, for example. Um, what do you think are the difficulties that beginners have in forming
Mhm.
their identity in second
Mhm.
language?
Mhm. Well, if we think about adults, yeah, because I do think this is a question that refers or that is more meaningful when we think about adults than when we think about children, because children's identities are actually being formed in whichever language they're learning. Yeah, so things tend to be a bit more fluid. But perhaps for adults, sometimes in discrepancies in the sense that perhaps in their own profession, in their own lives, they're very accomplished, they're very assertive, they are at the height perhaps of what they are doing, and then they enter a classroom. They have a need to learn that language, they have a need to become um, uh, proficient or to achieve a certain level in the language, but they might find themselves as complete beginners, and that can be really, it's almost like you are shooting shooting them back down, yeah, in the sense that I've achieved so much in my life, I've come so far, but now I find myself at the bottom again. And for some people that can be very disarming and very
Hmm.
difficult to deal with, yeah,
Yeah,
because
I remember. I mean, I still have very vivid memories of my beginning to learn Portuguese because it wasn't that long ago. Yeah, it was what 15, 16 years ago, and perhaps my relationship with the language is different from your relationship with English because for you it was a positive thing. It was a kind of escape to something else, whereas for me it was like a necessity, and I had all sorts of uncertainties, and I felt quite infantilized when speaking
mm,
Portuguese because I couldn't get the words out. And I think that's what beginners often feel. They feel the sense of
true.
helplessness. They feel a sense of being dependent on the teacher.
Mm,
And these people who are incredibly successful, as you mentioned. They are people who perhaps they may be high in their profession, they have authority, they have leadership roles,
mm,
but then suddenly they're stuck in this position where they're like little babies and they can't speak anymore. And that can have a real
mm,
effect on that moment is crucial for the teacher because if they do the wrong thing, then the identity is formed perhaps like your mother. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in that,
Mm-hmm.
I can't learn, I'm a bad learner, and it's not about that. It's about the other emotional aspects that you mentioned.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to mention. Yeah. When people are in this kind of vulnerable position, the attitude of the teacher needs to be um, really careful. The teacher needs to be really careful. Yeah. Because if the
Hmm.
teacher approaches a student with, let's say, very dumbed down language or treats the student in a condescending manner, I think that can um, really cement a very negative feeling towards the language, and which is so crucial that it's not so, especially at these early stages.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, in
it,
those early stages, sorry, we have a bit of lag here. Okay, I was going to say, um, yeah, beginners, like, they're so fragile in terms of, they'd have very little identity in that second language, except for the desire to learn it. Yeah,
mhm,
and so it's very, very
mhm,
fragile, and it can be broken or worn down at slightest touch. Yeah,
mhm,
but that's different to intermediate learners, isn't it? Intermediate learners already have a basis for the language, but then they hit, as we
mhm.
discussed with Jago a few weeks ago, where they hit the plateau where they feel that their progress is.
Yes. Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
often I feel like intermediate learners, exactly because of this plateau, yeah, perhaps they have this difficulty to own the language in a more emotional sense. A lot of the time, they have a mechanic understanding of the language. So they are able to use it well, sometimes very, very well for the level, but it tends to be sometimes um, there is not much intonation, there is not much feeling. There is, even when they're speaking about personal things, there is this kind of monotone going on. Yeah, because they still haven't taken that step further in order to own it and find themselves within that new language. They are still perhaps worried about rules and not making mistakes and things which are more related to how to use the language properly rather than to actually uh, dress themselves with the language and allow the language to surround them in that sense. Yeah. So, uh,
Yeah, and when we're thinking about that learner, which was myself not that long ago, it is still a moment where it's more formed than when they were a beginner, but their identity as language users of that language is still quite early, and it's only I think when you begin to feel that the language is yours, that you can begin to express emotion in it, and therefore that changes your pronunciation, your intonation, your
mhm,
ability to feel like it's part of you. Yeah, and that's a very
mhm,
important
mhm,
moment. I don't know if anybody remembers that moment when you learned to speak English, but I remember that moment when I was speaking Portuguese, where suddenly, despite being full of errors, yeah, I really felt like I owned the language and I could let go and I could communicate and express my emotions and
mhm,
have feelings in the language, which is
mhm,
I think is a very important step for identity.
mhm, mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, but
Yeah.
in your case, you describe it as a rational choice, yeah? There was this sort of watershed moment when you decided, I will stop caring and I will start owning. And
Perhaps again, it's the context that makes the difference because I was in Brazil, I still am in Brazil, and it was really absolutely necessary for me to stop caring about making mistakes and looking like an idiot. I had to reject that kind of the feeling of being a child, which I always
mm,
made me feel. Again, that may be related to my family background. I'm also the youngest, yeah, and so, that sense that I don't want to feel like a child again, like the youngest again. So I worried so much about not making mistakes, and therefore I didn't say anything because I would obviously make lots of mistakes. Um, but that moment came when I said, okay, I need this. I have to be able to do this because of where I am. So fuck it, if you excuse my French. I've got to do it. But perhaps that's different for, let's say, a Brazilian in a classroom in Brazil or in the Google Classroom in Brazil. maybe those watershed moments are fewer and far between. I don't know what you think.
Um, yeah, I was looking at the comments here actually, and mm, some people, let's see here. Okay, no, I was looking at the comments from a moment ago. Apparently, I disappeared from the screen for a while, but I hope I'm back now. Uh,
You are
yeah,
back.
I saw some comments like, "Where is Clara?" So I was worried that something was wrong with my internet. Sorry. Um, yeah, regarding your question, could you repeat it, please? I'm so sorry.
I was saying, do you think, because I was talking about my context and a very common
Mhm.
immigrant context of being in the culture and
Mm,
living in the language means that at some point you have to make the leap to try it out, otherwise you never do. Yeah, perhaps that's
absolutely.
different for our Brazilian learners in the Brazilian classroom with a Brazilian teacher, or it doesn't matter
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
nationality of the teacher actually, but
Mhm.
perhaps those leaps are less, they happen less often. It's more of a gradation or
Mm,
evolution. That's what I was asking.
mm.
Do you think it's possible to have that leap where you suddenly think, oh, I have to have this identity? Does that happen? Did that happen to you guys watching? Did you have a moment where you thought, I'm going there, I need to go there? Or was it kind of slower and more imperceptible?
Mm. Mm. I think I can perceive it in hindsight, but not necessarily. I knew
Mm.
that this is what was happening at the moment. Yeah. So for example, I remember the phase when I was a B2 learner, I had finished my English course. I had decided I would never ever study English again because I was fed up with English. Yeah. And it was the height, or for me, yeah, of my use, my internet usage. Yeah, I was starting using the internet a lot more than I did in the past. And then I suddenly realized, oh my God, I have access to so much more just because I speak English. And that's when I sort of started owning the language because it brought me a lot. Yeah, in many contexts, not just for college, which is what I was going through at the time, but also in a personal level because it allowed me to watch things that I was interested in. It allowed me to understand things which hadn't been translated into Portuguese yet. So I could see things or read things before other people, and that made me feel
Hmm.
like, oh, this is very useful. um, and that's actually what that was my leap. Yeah, but I think because it came in a very private environment, because it was me and the internet at home, perhaps I didn't perceive it as it was happening. But
So,
definitely.
okay, so in that sense, like in relation to the formation of your identity in language, it was like you perceived that there was actually something good for you there in order to develop that identity. Yeah, there was
Mm.
an interesting comment from Antonio, which was assimilating. Learning a language it's essentially assimilating a culture, and I was thinking about that for a moment, and then I, that comment came just as you were talking about this moment for you, because I was going to say, well, how can you assimilate a culture if you don't live in the culture, and that your communication is
Mm.
generally going to be with people who don't speak that language as their first language? But then you mentioned all the things you just mentioned, and you saw that there was a lot there in the language culture that you could get.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Especially nowadays, yeah, we perhaps in the past, a learner might find themselves in a moved from the language culture-wise. Yeah, they could learn a language in the classroom, but then if there were no people from that culture, or if there was not a cultural context near them that they could experience, they would be removed. But nowadays, with the internet and globalization, I think it has become so much easier for any learner, a learner of any language. I can say that because I've been trying to learn Japanese for many years now, and when I began, perhaps 20 years ago, the only source I had was the classroom. That's it. I had no people in my family who spoke Japanese. I could watch some perhaps anime, but that was it. Nowadays, the internet is just full of content for people trying to learn Japanese as a language. So nowadays it's more like I'm lazy. That's why I don't learn. In the past, it was a real difficulty, yeah, but nowadays it's more related to that. So
Yeah,
perhaps.
interesting. And then talking of lazy, actually, that reminded me of something. There are thinking about the fact that people form their identities in the language as they go, and it's a constantly evolving process. And there's never any fixed identity in whatever language we speak. Yeah, it changes and shifts depending on the context, where you are, who you're with. Um, One of the very important pedagogical implications is the fact that we need to recognize that it's a process, and we need to be sympathetic
Absolutely.
towards the process. Yeah,
Absolutely.
so if for the teachers who are watching, yeah, if you kind of label the learner sometimes, he's a bit slow or he's weak. Weak is a very common word to use with learners. Yeah, if you're using the word weak to describe a learner, you're negating the fact that there is a process going on in terms of the formation of their identity. And perhaps by you labeling them, you're going to be consciously or unconsciously they're going to be denying them some opportunities to help them form this identity in their second language, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yes. Sometimes, especially when we consider what is being taught, yeah, people tend to assimilate things at different rates, especially if they are not very meaningful to them personally. And again, this is a teacher's job to recognize what is or how can they present language in a meaningful way so that the learner can perceive that as something they have the desire to learn. Because when the desire
Mm-hmm.
is there, then there also is, let's say, an urgency for development.
Yeah. And I guess this thinking in the classroom, this idea of the identity evolving, and there are certain moments when the identity either moves forward slowly or it takes a leap, like as we were discussing in my case. Um, I guess we need to think about L1, like the first language in the classroom, as being a part of this process. Yeah. So we have on the one hand those learners who may go quite far to pre-intermediate or even intermediate sometimes, where they speak a lot of Portuguese in the classroom. That's a signal, isn't it? That's telling us something. That's
Mm-hmm.
telling that they're not quite ready to kind of take on that identity as a second language user fully,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're taking their time with it.
Mm-hmm. And also using L1 as an instrument of comfort, yeah. Because if you are within an environment where the teacher is using L2 and that feels foreign, that feels different, that feels perhaps stressful, the use of L1 comes as comfort. Yeah, you are supporting yourself through your own language, through the
Yeah.
language you you feel you can use in an emotional manner.
And you mentioned to me earlier as well, off screen, uh, the learner who only wants to use English. So if their colleague asks them a question in Portuguese, they respond in English. What's happening
Mhm,
there, you
mhm.
think, in terms of identity?
I think it's tough to say, yeah. Perhaps in that case, it's definitely a learner who's pushing themselves to develop in a new identity, perhaps, or make the best of any opportunity they have to speak the language.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other situation is also very frequent. Yeah, you have learners who hear the question, understand the question, they are perfectly capable of answering the question in English, but they still respond in Portuguese. So
Mm-hmm.
these people are in different stages emotionally in relation to the language. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of them are very interesting signals about where the learner is in terms of their identity in the second language, and therefore should be a good thing for you because you can actually think about what you're doing in the classroom, what's going to be appropriate. If you insist only on English in the classroom, especially for beginners, you could be setting a trap for yourself and for those learners later on, yeah?
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
so keep an eye out for those signals because it does help.
Mhm. And also as a teacher who, let's say, forbids students from using their own language, yeah, we fall on exactly as you said, the trap of perhaps stigmatizing L1. Yeah, and then there's this whole thing of students perceiving then L1 as not as valuable as the language they are trying to learn. And that can, again, bring some very negative emotions in them because
Mm-hmm.
they might feel, so what do you have against my language? Yeah. So as
Yeah,
teachers, it's very tough. There needs to be a measure of acceptance
mm-hmm.
towards L1.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive subject, definitely, and of course the peer group may also an importance in relation to whether the learner wants to speak English more in the classroom. Yeah, and so that brings us to power dynamics, yeah, which is another important pedagogical aspect, which perhaps we do recognize it, but not in those terms. We normally think of there's a dominant student or there's a very quiet student, um, and those are valid kind of demonstrations. But power dynamics are very important between you and the learner, and between the learners themselves. So, there are things you have to think about in order to kind of make sure that the power dynamics are more equal, that it gives more opportunities for everybody to
Mhm.
participate. Um,
Mhm.
so thinking about the activities you do, for example, yeah. Um, we know about introverts and that they participate a bit less in the class. I mean, you yourself are an introvert, yeah. So
Mhm.
what has a teacher done, or what could a teacher do in the case of an introvert in order to make sure that they are a valid member of the classroom community?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's actually an excellent question. Yeah, because many teachers who are not introverts, they sort of label the introvert student as, you know, perhaps the quiet one, the one who doesn't like participating. Yeah. Um, I I personally tend to, especially when we work online, I feel that the online environment is very friendly towards introverts because I often, especially when I have groups and I'm going to send students off to do pair work, for example, and that pair work is based on uh, anything that they have to write and then discuss. Yeah. I always give them the opportunity to decide whether they want to do it quietly first and then discuss their answers, or whether they want to start just discussing. And I believe that that is very helpful for introvert students because the fact that they are allowed this moment to breathe and take in and prepare for the fact that later they are going to have to say something. That is very important for introverts because
Mm-hmm.
it's not that they don't want to speak, it's just that this thing of, okay, now you go and you speak, that can be very jarring for them. And it can get an introvert student to perhaps feel paralyzed. So allowing students a moment's silence or a moment's preparation to gather their thoughts. The extrovert students are probably going to say, no, I don't need any time. Let's do it now. Yeah. So you do need to achieve a certain balance, but allowing these moments where the introvert can settle down, gather their thoughts, think about what they're going to say, that can be very helpful. And it can make them much more willing to participate in any speaking activity than they would be otherwise.
I think having that quiet moment to gather your thoughts is also very useful for everybody, not just the introverts, but extroverts themselves. A moment to reflect and think is something that often is missing, and that could be very useful for them. Enjoy the silence, said Fabrizio. Yeah, um, and then I guess the other thing is you mentioned that being online, it's more egalitarian. They do get the chance to write comments and write answers rather than have necessarily to shout them out in the classroom, which they maybe
Mm.
normally have to do. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I guess what
Exactly.
that's suggesting, thinking about the different power dynamics in the classroom, the different kinds of people we have, the extroverts, the introverts, the ambiverts, and the other kind of verts that there exist. I guess if we have a variety of activities, um, that's
Mhm.
also going to be better in terms of creating a more balanced power dynamic, and it's
Mhm.
going to give people better opportunities, especially if the material you're working with or you're developing is kind of it encourages authentic and natural communication.
Mhm. And also the acceptance of the teacher in the sense of being aware that, you know, so and so doesn't speak much, not because they don't want to or not because they can't, but because that's their style and that's how they are as people. And they wouldn't speak anyway, even if it was their first language. I think that really fosters rapport with students. Yeah, it
Hmm.
really helps the teacher gain students' trust, and over time, depending on how long you work with those students, it might even encourage them to participate more.
Hmm. Absolutely. And so, when we think, as we've mentioned a few times, yeah, the delicate formation of this identity, uh, we often talk about how, we could influence a student to do great things. We could be the inspiration for them in their lives that could then lead them to a very positive outcome. And
Mhm.
at its crux, that is all about how they feel about their identity in that language. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's when we
Even
come to apologies. Go on.
no, even when you don't consider the aspect from a perspective of identity, it's still that's what's happening.
Hmm. Absolutely. And so that leads us just to kind of wrap up. We, that leads people to have a better self-image and a better identity about themselves as second language users. And we spoke a little bit earlier about how we think other people perceive us in our second language or our other languages. What about the way we perceive ourselves? Yeah, how do you
Mhm.
think that you perceive yourself in English or in Japanese or both?
Uh, I do agree, and that is thinking about myself in the various roles that I take part in through life. Yeah? But I do believe that English does make me feel more confident, uh, and perhaps in Portuguese, I perceive myself as more reluctant to speak. So
Mm,
I do think my introvert trait, yeah, is more explicit in Portuguese than it is in English. In English, I feel more comfortable to take the lead, to go ahead and do something, sort something out. I don't mind it as much. But I do find myself in Portuguese in certain situations where I actually sort of stop and think, do I really want to say something? Maybe I don't.
mm.
And I end up being quiet, whereas in English, I might have said something, you know.
Hmm.
So I do perceive that that's a trait of mine that gets very highlighted when I'm speaking Portuguese. What about in your case?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess there are a number of things going on with me. One of the biggest considerations is the fact that I'm a foreigner here in Brazil, yeah? And so in some ways, English is definitely a prestige language in Brazil. Yeah, so that's a factor. When we bring into the fact that my role as a teacher, similar to you, brings a certain authority to it. The fact that I'm a so-called native speaker shouldn't make any difference, but it does. It does bring an extra authority to the situation. So in English, I kind of feel here in Brazil, especially, I feel kind of authoritative, as opposed to authoritarian. Okay, I'm not an authoritarian.
Mhm.
I feel
Mhm.
authoritative, and that kind of, I guess that, and also my intellectual identity as a human being is kind of more. considered and kind of intellectual and thoughtful, all that kind of stuff. And in Portuguese, I guess I get the opportunity to be a bit more playful because I'm not seen as an authority in Portuguese by anybody. I mean, I'm far from an authority because I still make quite a few mistakes, yeah, even though I can communicate. And so I guess I take that fact that I make these mistakes and to say, well, I don't need to be this authority figure all the time. I can play about with the language. I can be a silly, you know. And I like Portuguese, the fact that it's nice. You can play with the words a bit more, I think, than in English, the sounds and so on. And so I would say, bom dia instead of bom dia. You know, this is the old joke to your father, yeah. So I guess it does make sense that I'm a bit more. What was the word that was used before about me in Portuguese? I'm a bit.
Cara legal.
I'm a bit. Cara legal, yeah. I'm a bit more of a cara legal, and I'm a bit more relaxed. Perhaps I'm a bit more. I don't feel like I'm more friendly, but perhaps my bearing is more friendly because I have a lack of authority in the language. Yeah, so that's definitely. It makes me a bit more of a brincalhão in Portuguese than I am in English, I think. Yeah.
Do you feel then that it you transport that into English? Has that changed you in English at all?
God, what a hard question. It's very hard to answer that question because I've been living in Brazil for 17 years, yeah, and I obtained almost a very distinct identity in Brazil that I didn't have in the same area as in the UK or in the other countries I lived in. So I'm not sure if I can answer the question because I think everything, my English and my Portuguese, my identity in both, have both been changed by Brazil. So it's not like I can say one, like the Portuguese identity has affected the English or vice versa. They've kind of gone in tandem. So perhaps they've both developed in a similar way, yeah? The fact that I hug people a lot more since I left England, you know, I lived in Belgium, I hugged people more than in England, but now I hug people even more. Perhaps that's related to culture and language in Brazil. So I think there is definitely an influence and definitely a positive influence.
Yeah, some of the comments here, yeah, people were saying, Jonathan is saying, I believe it's so much easier for me to play in English than in Portuguese. Maybe because of what you just said, yeah, in terms of you feel like maybe you have to be more authoritative in your own language.
Yeah, the other thing as well related to that playing is also I think the fact that the other language is separate. It becomes part of you, but it's still a separate thing that you can examine like an artifact. And that's why when you learn, you teach the other language or you learn the other language, you suddenly discover so much about your own language. And because it's a separate artifact, you can therefore examine it and play with it a little bit more. But perhaps that's the topic of a whole other live. That would be really interesting to talk about how we see the other language as something separate, as something to be examined and played with. Yeah. But no, absolutely, it's really interesting, this idea of who we are and what we become in another language. And, you know, I really would like to hear what other people have to say. And maybe we continue this conversation on Instagram when this video gets posted. Please leave your comments or send us a DM because I really love this topic. I love the idea of identity generally. And I think in second language, you know, because it's been quite transformative for me. And I would like to hear what other people think about it.
Absolutely. And it is a topic that comes up every now and then in our conversations, which is why we decided to bring this to a live. I'm sorry that in the beginning the sound was not so good, yeah, and I had some issues with the connection, but I think in the end things sort of got sorted out. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So once again, thank you so much, Clara, and happy birthday once again to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's time to celebrate now.
Yeah, we're going to open some wine in a little while. Thank you for everybody who joined us, and especially, you know, all those comments have been awesome. And I'm sorry that we haven't had a chance to take a look at all of them. But get in touch and let's carry on the conversation. It's a really interesting topic. Next week is something else. I'm not going to tell you what it is now because it's a surprise, okay? Okay, take care, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.